The American frontier in the late 19th century was vast. Staked plains, treacherous mountains, and scattered army posts defined the landscape. Traditional communication technologies were woefully inadequate for this environment. Telegraph and telephone lines were revolutionary, but they were fragile threads. They were easily severed by harsh weather, difficult terrain, or deliberate destruction in combat. General Nelson A. Miles commanded troops across Montana. He recognized that intelligence taking weeks to cross the plains by horseback could be delivered in a matter of hours by air. The strategic necessity of this speed had already been proven across the Atlantic. During the brutal Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, the siege of Paris dramatically showcased the reliability of homing pigeons. These birds flew high above the Prussian lines. They carried 150,000 official dispatches. Utilizing microphotography, they shrunk entire newspapers onto tiny bits of text. This feathered precedent spurred military adoption worldwide. Miles's advocacy led to swift action in the United States. In 1878, Chief Signal Officer Albert J. Meyer officially began the U.S. Army's use of pigeons. He recognized the critical need for dependable long-distance communication. Meyer sent the first 24 military birds directly to Colonel Miles in Montana. Coupled with the growing popularity of civilian homing pigeon racing, a readily available pool of trained birds and experienced handlers emerged. Yet, the initial military experiments were plagued by setbacks. Early doubts about the bird's utility were fueled by inexperienced trainers. These trainers failed to grasp the meticulous process required to acclimate birds to new environments. Colonel Miles's early trials were hampered by this lack of understanding. The pigeons were often left unable to navigate the unfamiliar landscape. This early unreliability contrasted sharply with the success of the heliograph. This sun-powered signaling device could transmit messages up to 140 miles. It formed an 800-mile network across Arizona to track Geronimo. Its glinting messages, as one officer noted, disheartened the Apache. This showcased the power of rapid, if sun-dependent, communication in land warfare. The Navy, however, saw a unique opportunity for these birds. Existing naval signaling methods flag, horn, and light were severely limited in range. This left the sea vulnerable to undetected threats. Lieutenant Richard Wainwright and French professor Henri Marion championed the pigeon messenger for coast defense. Marion quoted promoters of the successful European Manubia experiment. He declared, "We have got the pigeons, we have got the stations, we have got the ships, and we have got the ships, and we have got the sea." The true turning point arrived in 1888. This was the year the experimental pigeon station was established at Key West, Florida. Under Chief Signal Officer Adolphus W. Greeley, this moved beyond anecdotal experimentation. It became a scientific military discipline. Key West became the proving ground for necessary protocols. This included meticulous meteorological record-keeping and specific feed formulas. The rigorous selection focused not just on speed, but on intelligence and persistence. It also focused on the birds' proprietary instincts, their strong dislike of change. The birds were handled with calculated care. Messages were no longer crudely attached. They were handwritten on thin paper, rolled into goose quills, and secured. This methodical approach debunked the notion that pigeons were inherently unreliable. It proved they could handle the elements and the open sea. The station achieved successful overwater flights, including a 90-mile journey from Key West to Havana, Cuba. 9 birds consistently proved reliable for 100 miles over the open ocean. Despite the proven strategic benefits and cost-effectiveness, the momentum stalled. Colonel Miles's later, satisfactory trials out of Fort Keogh, Montana, confirmed their value. Yet, the U.S. Army missed a significant opportunity in 1891. The Signal Corps was transferred to civilian status as the U.S. Weather Bureau. This organizational shift effectively severed the Army's direct operational control and interest in the pigeon service. It sidelined a communication technology that, while ancient, offered a resilient and cost-effective backup. The groundwork laid at Key West, however, was not wasted. It established the essential foundation for military animal husbandry and communication science. It prepared the way for the inevitable return of the feathered courier. They would be needed when future wars exposed the fatal flaws of wires and waves. The growing drumbeat of war with Spain in the late 1890s forced a confrontation. The U.S. military, particularly the Navy, had to face the perilous fragility of its communications infrastructure. Reliance on vulnerable telegraph wires was, as one observer noted, resting the nation's safety on a slender thread. In response, the Navy moved decisively to establish a robust coast signal service. They recognized the homing pigeon as the necessary resilient backup. Secretary of the Navy Hilary A. Herbert formally authorized the establishment of pigeon cotes in January 1896. Cotes were placed at 6 principal Navy yards, including Boston, Newport, and Key West. Commodore William T. Chadwick oversaw the creation of standardized lofts. The first official government manual detailing the meticulous care and training of the birds was published. This solidified the service's operational framework. The Spanish-American War, declared in April 1898, provided the ultimate field test. Enthusiasm for the service was immediate. Civilian pigeon fanciers like T. Berry and E. F. Baker offered thousands of their finest birds for duty. The conflict saw pigeons flying critical dispatches up to 150 miles at sea, often against strong winds. Commander John Davis utilized the system to send a personal note to his wife from 200 miles offshore. This added a distinctly human element to the wartime communication. Though short-lived, the service proved its capability for sea duty. It fulfilled the promise envisioned years earlier by the advocates of the Manubia experiment. But the moment of triumph was fleeting. Concurrent with the war's quick conclusion came the rapid, undeniable ascent of wireless telegraphy. Guglielmo Marconi's successful demonstrations of radio communication over water were undeniable. His work during the 1899 America's Cup race showcased a technological superiority that pigeons simply could not match. Wireless worked under all weather conditions and offered instantaneous transmission. This was a decisive advantage over the fastest feathered courier. By 1901, Marconi had successfully bridged the Atlantic with his signals. The verdict was swift and absolute. Lieutenant Commander G. W. Denfield observed that nothing, neither mechanical nor feathered, could compete with the speed of radio waves. The organizational pivot was immediate. By 1902, the Navy had sold its homing pigeons, officially discontinuing the service. The dream of a winged messenger service, so earnestly pursued, went, literally, into thin air. It was superseded by the instantaneous nature of the radio wave. The U.S. military had firmly cast its lot with electronic technology. They regarded the pigeon as a charming yet obsolete relic of a bygone era. This abandonment proved short-sighted. The Army received a brief, urgent reminder of the pigeon's enduring value during the Mexican punitive expedition. Brigadier General John J. Pershing's forces experienced firsthand the limitations of the new technology. Heavy wireless wagon sets struggled over the mountainous, roadless terrain. In these conditions, the pigeon showcased its inherent resilience to harsh weather and difficult landscapes. It offered a much more efficient and tried-and-true communication solution. The true vindication of the feathered courier came with the outbreak of World War I in Europe. The front lines devolved into the brutal, static hell of trench warfare. There, the supposed superiority of modern communication vanished. Wire lines were shredded by incessant artillery fire. Early radio sets were crude, vulnerable to interception, and cumbersome to transport. They were easily incapacitated by atmospheric disturbances or physical damage. The U.S. military's prior decision to prioritize electronic communication had left it tragically unprepared. When the U.S. declared war on Germany in April 1917, the Army lacked any organized pigeon service. This necessitated an urgent, almost frantic mobilization. Civilian expertise was rapidly leveraged. Fanciers offered tens of thousands of birds. Men like David C. Buskall and John L. Carney were commissioned. Their job was to rapidly build a sophisticated military pigeon infrastructure from scratch. It was a desperate effort to reclaim the vital, resilient communication lifeline that had been prematurely cast aside. The sudden U.S. declaration of war in April 1917 demanded the immediate creation of a military asset. This asset had been deliberately dismantled years earlier. The American Expeditionary Forces under General Pershing required a communication system that could survive the industrial slaughter of the Western Front. Colonel Edgar Russell, Chief Signal Officer for the AEF, was tasked with establishing the American Pigeon Service in France. This monumental effort relied almost entirely on hastily commissioned civilian expertise. thousands of men were trained as pigeoneers. They learned the meticulous art of bird husbandry. They established lofts across the US and Europe. They prepared the winged couriers for the unimaginable destruction of the trenches. For the soldiers entrusted with their care, the pigeons were far more than mere equipment. They were fragile, living links to survival. They demanded a dedication that often eclipsed the needs of the men themselves. Lieutenant Charles A. Corstar later affirmed this commitment. He said, "Our men gave first consideration to the birds." He recounted that in Africa, if there was but one cup of water available, the birds drank before the men. This commitment was essential. These living wireless couriers were about to enter a landscape where man-made communication lines withered and broke. The heavy, vulnerable wires and the primitive, interceptable radios failed under the constant barrage. The true integration of the American pigeon into the Great War came on March 17, 1918. Amidst the mud and shattered earth, a pigeon named Gunpowder was released from the trenches. Trained by Sergeant Louis Swanker, it carried the first official American pigeon message delivered from the front lines. This moment symbolized the service's operational entry into combat. Pigeons proved equally vital in the nascent world of military aviation. Early aircraft, constructed of spruce wood and fabric, were notoriously fragile. Their communication systems were crude. Aviators whose planes crashed into the vast, unforgiving ocean often found their wireless sets flooded and useless. They were left stranded and facing certain death. The U.S. Naval Air Service in France rapidly adopted the feathered courier for patrol and rescue. These pigeons were silent, swift, and direct. They were less susceptible to interception than radio and functioned when all else failed. Out of more than 800 pigeons used in naval operations, only 11 went missing in action. This proved their reliability as true feathered lifesavers. They protected coastlines and convoys. In 1 year, they delivered over 10,000 messages from patrol boats and planes off the French coast. This included 219 from seaplanes downed at sea. The heroism of the war pigeons was astonishing. It was driven by an innate, fierce motivation to return home. Their service was a testament to resilience. It culminated in a remarkable 95% message delivery success rate by the war's end. This success was achieved through skies of steel. They faced not only enemy fire but also predators like hawks and falcons. Their flights were often desperate races against time, carried out even when severely wounded. Pigeons like President Wilson, a black cock, and the Mocha, a red check splash cock, sustained grievous wounds. They endured shrapnel-studded chests, lost eyes, and fractured limbs, yet they managed to complete their missions. Their willingness to fly through the most challenging conditions solidified their reputation. They were established as the flying telegraph. The military had learned, through brutal necessity, that the oldest communication method could often be the most reliable. The chaotic, desperate mobilization of the Great War had proven the pigeon's value. The interwar period transformed the service from an emergency measure into a highly professionalized scientific military asset. The U.S. military was determined never again to be caught without its most resilient courier. In 1925, Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, became the permanent Signal Corps post. It housed the Pigeon Breeding and Training Center. By 1927, the Signal Corps maintained over 1,000 birds. They were kept in 16 lofts stretching from the continental U.S. to Hawaii and the Philippines. The heroic birds of the last war, like Cher Ami, were retired to the Churchill Loft. They served as feathered symbols of the service's new permanent status. This commitment was a direct challenge to the notion that radio had rendered them obsolete. In mountainous regions, radio waves were often trapped. Electronic sets were heavy and cumbersome. Pigeons remained, as one officer noted, a much more efficient and tried-and-true method. With the advent of World War II, the service exploded in scale and sophistication. The training center transferred to Camp Crowder, Missouri, in August 1942. It swelled to house up to 12,000 birds at its peak. This was not a simple matter of housing. It was a rigorous scientific endeavor. Major Poutre, a key figure in training, emphasized that the goal was not raw speed, but psychological resilience. He insisted, "What we want is a bird that will get back, one that won't get flustered, one that is intelligent enough to be self-reliant." This demand for reliability led to meticulous record-keeping and classification. Birds were subjected to rigorous training, learning to fly at night. They endured extreme conditions. These included altitudes up to 35,000 feet and temperatures from 45 below zero to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The classification system, ranging from A1 to A5, was a critical evaluation. It demanded at least 2 years of consistent success before a bird was deemed a truly reliable messenger. The training paid off dramatically. During tactical operations across the globe, the Signal Corps achieved an almost unbelievable 99% message delivery rate. The war also saw the pigeons employed in missions of complex espionage and speed. In occupied Europe, British military intelligence known as MI-14 managed Operation Columba. This was a clandestine effort to gather intelligence. Pigeons, often strapped into baskets attached to mini parachutes, were dropped behind enemy lines. They carried miniature spy kits, a bakelite tube, ultra-thin paper, and a special pencil. These feathered agents of hope were picked up by civilians yearning for liberation. The messages returned were often poignant and desperate. They reflected a deep-seated resentment toward the occupiers. One message read, "No other news to give you except to beg you to make an end to this as soon as you can before we die of hunger." The return of these birds, though often low percentage, provided invaluable intelligence. They reported on German troop movements and civilian morale. The pigeon had turned into a vital, covert intelligence asset. In the fast-moving combat zones of Italy, pigeons provided a crucial solution for rapid tactical intelligence. During the brutal fighting at Cassino, the need to quickly transmit live film from reconnaissance flights was paramount. On May 24, 1944, a pigeon named Old 17 flew film at 50 miles per hour. It carried the precious cargo in a 4-inch cylinder. This beat out traditional transport methods that would have taken hours. Perhaps the most dramatic illustration of their life-saving speed occurred on October 18, 1943, in Italy. Allied forces had just seized the strategically vital town of Colvi Vecchia. Headquarters, unaware of the rapid advance, had already scheduled a massive bombing raid on the location. Radio silence was required, and there was no time to lay wire. A pigeon named G.I. Joe was released with a message to call off the strike. G.I. Joe flew 20 miles in just 20 minutes. He arrived at the airbase moments before the bombers took off. The raid was aborted, preventing a catastrophic friendly fire incident. This would have cost the lives of over 1,000 Allied troops. G.I. Joe's flight was so critical that he became the only American bird to receive the Dickin Medal. The Dickin Medal is the highest award for animal bravery in conflict. Pigeons also provided critical backup for decentralized operations at home. The escalating threat of German U-boats, known as Operation Drumbeat, off the U.S. East Coast was severe. This necessitated the enlistment of civilian vessels into the coastal picket force. These small ships and the Navy's blimps often had limited radio range. They also needed to maintain radio silence to avoid detection, releasing pigeons from the blimp windows, a careful process to avoid the propeller wash provided a vital, undetectable communication link. Even civilian organizations, such as the Civil Air Patrol and State Guards, recognized their utility. They used them for search and rescue in remote areas. They trained hundreds of birds to carry messages and even photographs of wreckage. The humble homing pigeon, seemingly anachronistic in an age of radar and radio, remained an indispensable tool of resilience. It proved that when technology failed, nature's most dedicated courier would still get the message through. Despite the availability of advanced radio systems, the homing pigeon remained vital through the Korean War. It provided crucial supplemental resilience when electronic methods failed. The rugged topography of the Korean peninsula defeated modern wire communication. The endless maze of ridges, ravines, and muddy rice paddies meant lines were perpetually severed by enemy artillery and tanks. Radio battery life was limited. The necessity of maintaining radio silence often made electronic transmission impossible. Into this breach stepped the feathered courier. The service also highlighted the diverse contributions to the military. This included the selection of wavies, or women accepted for volunteer emergency service as pigeoneers. Their role underscored that success in this unique branch required a specific temperament. These women possessed the sympathetic understanding and patience necessary for meticulous care. They cared for birds expected to fly across inhospitable mountainous regions. The birds overcame bad weather, predatory hawks, and small arms fire to deliver their message. The late 1950s, however, brought the inevitable technological reckoning. Highly reliable, small-scale electronic communication systems finally overcame the limitations of terrain and weather. The order came down on November 30th, 1956. The US military would officially discontinue the breeding and training of homing pigeons. This marked the quiet end of a 75-year tradition. It was a stark juxtaposition between the oldest, simplest biological form of communication and the sophisticated digital age. For decades, the direction of a battle and the lives of many people had rested on the ability of a pigeon to fly home. Now, that ability was deemed strategically obsolete. The official end arrived in 1957. On March 23rd, Fort Monmouth hosted the final, bittersweet sale of 1,018 military birds. It was far from a quiet disbandment. The event drew an enormous, enthusiastic crowd of pigeon fanciers and breeders. They were eager to acquire the proven bloodlines of war heroes like G.I. Joe and Cherami. Major Ron Frayne, witnessing the scene, later recalled the atmosphere as resembling a Rolling Stones concert. It was a chaotic, joyous, and deeply symbolic farewell to the feathered veterans. The pigeon breeding and training branch was officially discontinued that May, marking the passage of time and technological evolution. Yet, the unique capabilities of the Columba livia continued to intrigue researchers. The story of the war pigeon refused to simply go into thin air. From 1977 to 1983, Project Sea Hunt proved the pigeon's unparalleled observational skill for search and rescue. Trained to spot the color orange, the birds were positioned in clear domes beneath rescue aircraft. They spotted targets a staggering 90% of the time. This far surpassed the human crews, who managed only 38%. The project demonstrated that even in the age of satellites, the simple biological mechanism of a pigeon's eye remained superior for specific visual tasks. Though the US military retired the service, the enduring significance of the war pigeon legacy underscores the importance of adaptability and resilience. Nations like China still maintain large pigeon corps as a contingency against electronic warfare. They train tens of thousands of birds to carry critical intelligence. Historians and military strategists now advocate for their return. They recognize that in an era dominated by cyber warfare and electronic jamming, the incorruptible zero-emission messenger remains crucial. It is the ultimate form of redundant communication. The memory of these heroic, unsung messengers persists. These brave, dedicated animals flew through skies of steel. Their critical contributions as feathered couriers are never truly forgotten.